Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our next HR Talk webinar. My name is Dave Beattie. I'm the pilot for today. Co-pilot Priyanka as usual. Today we're going to cover independent contractors. I'm going to only deal with individuals and not companies. I will do personal service companies at a later stage. I think we've got enough content today to give you a good idea of what the problem is and the tools that we've got to potentially solve that problem. And then I'll throw in a bit of my own advice in terms of what you should keep to keep SARS at bay. Just a little bit about me. I'm the Legislative Compliance Manager at HR Talk. I've been in this organization for 22 years. And prior to that, I was at SARS for 6 very interesting years. So I've got a bit of a varied background in terms of knowing how both sides of the fence deal with issues. The independent contractor issue is an issue that has been around all that time. Hugely problematic area. I just thought it would be best to, in 45 minutes, go through the issues and give you the tools and hopefully the confidence to deal with this matter. So my first bullet point, the independent contractor issue remains probably the most contentious issue in the fourth schedule of the Income Tax Act. And when I talk about the fourth schedule, I talk about remuneration, the definition of remuneration, and I talk about who earns remuneration and what the circumstances have to be in terms of earning remuneration for there to be an employee's tax issue. So a decision in favor of the independent contractor or employee decides effectively whether employee's tax is payable. If the person is adjudicated to be an independent contractor, there would be no employee's tax because there's no employer-employee relationship. But if the tests conclusively or realistically prove that there is an employer-employee relationship, there would be remuneration paid between those two parties and there would be employee's tax. And we'll go through the consequences of getting this wrong a bit later. It's important to remember that the liability of an employer to deduct employee's tax is dependent on whether remuneration is paid. And as I've just said, if there is this employer-employee relationship, we would pay remuneration and there would be employee's tax. So what is the problem? Obviously, there's a lot of pressure on a potential employer to ascertain the status of this individual that they're contracting with. Now, I often get called into companies to assist with this process, and often there is pressure from higher up in the organization to treat an individual in a certain way. Now, I always feel quite sorry for the payroll administrator or the HR manager who's required to process this transaction when it is clear that the legislation is not being followed. And my question to the management at that point is always, who's going to take responsibility when SARS come in and do an adjudication and find that there is an employer-employee relationship and that tax was supposed to be deducted? The chance of the recovery of tax from that individual at that point is almost null. So the employer would end up having a very, very expensive transaction. In other words, paying, as an example, 50,000 Rand a month to this independent contractor in inverted commas. And then when SARS come and they raise assessments for the last 3 years, having to deal with the actual tax, the additional penalty and interest that would be levied on the company for making the wrong decision. So it's very, very important, and I always tell payroll and HR people to dig their heels in and document, so that, if there are any issues, your hands are clean in terms of the decision that you've made. Okay, so what we're going to be chatting about, sorry, I should have mentioned it earlier. We're going to be chatting about SARS Interpretation Note 17, version 4. We're going to go through this interpretation note because it is a tool that SARS provide, and as you can see, it's version 4, so it's a living document. It's SARS interpretation of the legislation, and they give practical guidance as to navigate through the legislation. So they don't just throw you to the wolves and say, read the Income Tax Act. They look at the legislation and they break it down and they interpret, or they give their interpretation. Now, it's not a document that you could use to beat SARS up in court, because they're always going to refer back to the Income Tax Act. But it is a pretty good guide. And as I said, with it being version 4, there's been lots of changes and lots of tweaking of the interpretation. And I'm pretty confident that if you follow the interpretation note, you will be fine if SARS do a review. Okay, so what we're going to look at is we look at the tools that this interpretation note identifies to determine the status of any person. The first tool is known as the Statutory Tests, and there are 2 statutory tests, both are conclusive in nature. If the first test is met, the person is deemed to be carrying on a trade independently, okay, and will not be conducting an independent trade. And if you're not conducting an independent trade, then you're likely to, you are going to be an employee, and you're going to be remuneration, and you're going to be subject to employees' tax. If the second test is met, the person will be deemed to be carrying on a trade independently and would not be earning remuneration. So there is a decision table on the interpretation note that you can follow if this becomes too wordy for you. But we're going to go through these tests and you'll see that it isn't really that difficult. It is possible that the person could meet the first test and be deemed not to be carrying on an independent trade, but meet the second test and be deemed to be carrying on an independent trade. Very, very important to note that the second test overrides the first test. The second tool is the common law tests, and this is used to determine whether a person is independent contractor or employee as well. And we're going to go through them in detail because there is 20 points that we have to cover in the common law dependence test. The common law tests do not allow a simple checklist approach though, and it's important that you form an overall or dominant impression as to the relationship. We're going to cover that a bit in detail more later, and we're going to stress the importance of not just using the tick box exercise. SARS are not going to accept that as an evaluation. In practice, the statutory tests are considered first. The common law tests are applied after that to determine the person's status, only if the statutory tests are not applicable in a particular situation. Very importantly, it is the employer's responsibility to determine the status. With most issues around employees' tax, SARS puts the legislation in the lap of the employer, and they require the employer to make the correct adjudication. You can't use ignorance as an excuse for not applying the law correctly, and we can see recently SARS tightening up legislation to penalize employers for making errors. That's why it's quite important that you've got a good grasp on legislation. If you're running your payroll yourself, you're attending all the seminars, you're doing all the evaluations possible. And if you're still not confident, then you should be outsourcing that responsibility to someone who does know the legislation. You can do periodic reviews, or outsourcing the payroll completely if you are not a payroll person and you're desperately trying to run your payroll yourself. Ignorance of the law is not an excuse, and we are seeing SARS putting the hammer down in terms of the application of penalties. SARS are not permitted to consider applications from employers for the evaluation of of a person. Way back at the beginning of this process, the legislation was obviously a lot more vague, and SARS would take queries from taxpayers. But as I said, being an ex-SARS person, guaranteed the person is only going to put the positive foot forward in terms of the facts that they're going to provide SARS. And SARS got burnt quite often providing a decision and not having all the facts and it being wrong. So SARS are not going to consider any applications. SARS will not provide any judgments in any form in advance in terms of fact or anything where there is obviously a resource-intensive process that has to happen. SARS will not issue non-binding private opinions on this case either. So the pressures on the employer, as I said, because if you mess this up, you're not only going to have to pay PAYE, you have to pay a late payment penalty, you have to pay interest, and if SARS deem you to be negligent, there might be additional tax. So let's have a look at the statutory tests quickly. The first test is the person will not be carrying on an independent trade if both parts of the test are satisfied. And the first part of that test is the services duties performed mainly at the premises? And just the definition of mainly is more than 50%. So if the person is at your premises more than 50%, okay, the first test is quite clearly satisfied. Quite simple, not much to consider there, other than maybe they work at your client's premises. That might be deemed to be your premises if that person is working for you only. The second part is the person subject to the control, okay, in the manner in which duties are performed and the hours are worked, and supervision in terms of also the worker's duties and the hours worked. So if this person that you're contracting with is under the controlled supervision of someone, you are quite clearly going to be regarded as having satisfied that test, and you're going to be regarded as an employee. If both elements of the first test apply, the person would not be deemed to be an independent contractor. Simple as that. Any amount received by this person would be remuneration and would be subject to employees' tax, as said before. Okay, the second test is a little bit more complicated. As I said to you, the second test overrides the first test. So a person who employs 3 or more full-time employees, very importantly, who are not connected parties in relation to the employer, and are engaged in the business throughout the year of assessments, is deemed to be carrying on an independent trade. Remember, this is an overriding test. So you might have failed the first tests, first 2 parts of the test 1, okay, suggesting you're an employee. But if you've gone to the length of having 3 or more full-time employees, you're not connected parties, SARS is saying that you've taken on enough business risk effectively to be regarded as independent. Now, please note, they talk about connected parties, they talk about the third degree of consanguinity. If this person is in any way related to you, and you can potentially pay them a not market-related salary, quite clearly you've muddied the waters and this test is going to be scrutinized. So putting mom and dad and brother on as employees, paying them $2,000 a month so that you can save 50,000 Rand of tax a month is quite clearly not going to be allowed by SARS. So SARS are going to scrutinize that relationship. They're going to identify what this person does. Are they there full-time? Are they earning a market-related salary? Otherwise, they're going to start asking questions. Any amounts received by an independent contractor must be coded under IP5 code 3616. And all that means is 3616 means that the contractor, when they submit their tax return, is going to have this income from this organization on an IP5, and it just means that they're going to be allowed to claim expenses against that code. When they talk about this exclusionary paragraph 23M, 23M is basically saying that you can't claim private expenses. And, if you're an independent contractor, the expenses that SARS deem to be private become business to an extent. In other words, if you're trading from home and you're claiming a home office because of you're an independent contractor, you'd be entitled to those expenses. Okay, now we're going to move on to the common law dominance impression test. I have copied the 20-point indicators in slides a bit later, which we'll go through. But what I want to do now is I just want to work through the three different categories of indicators. Okay, so very important test, and this is where you're going to have to keep very, very accurate records of your evaluation of this person. And it's important that you understand each of the 20 indicators, because each of them has a role and a weighting in terms of the determination of what this person is. The test makes use of several indicators of different significance or weight that have been applied to the relative context. So, when you're dealing with someone, there's a story, okay? And that story is now going to be pulled apart in terms of these 20 indicators. And as we said, this is not a tick box exercise. You have to actually apply this and write your findings. Very important that no single indicator is conclusive or determinant of a person's status. The test is essentially an analytical tool that, if applied in an employment environment, will help establish the dependence or independence of the person. So you're going to get a dominant impression, as the name suggests, of this person's status. The common law dominance impression test sets out 20 of the more common indicators. So there are these 20 indicators. If you want to look at more indicators, facts, information, well, that's up to you. As I've said, these indicators are not meant to be exhaustive. They are interrelated, but dependent on circumstances. Some indicators may become irrelevant, while others become more relevant. So, as I said to you, the story dictates the importance of the indicators. The indicators point to whether there's been an acquisition of productive capacity. Okay, so when I talk about, or when they talk about productive capacity, when you're in employment, your employer acquires your productive capacity to utilize your skills in whatever way they want. So if there is the acquisition of productive capacity, so as I've said, the labor power, capacity to work, or simply effort, it's going to suggest an employment relationship between an employer and an employee. The indicators are divided into three categories: near conclusive, in other words, those relating most directly to the acquisition of this above mentioned productive capacity. Persuasive, these are, establishing a degree of control of this person. And resonant, okay, and when I talk about resonant, it's resident of there either being an employee or an employer relationship, or an independent contractor relationship. The classification or weighting is intended to assist auditors in making their determination. So as I said to you, obviously the top category would be weighted more heavily, and as you go down to category 3, the resonance indicators, they would be obviously less important. The weightings are based on SARS assessment as to what is appropriate and fair to an employer an employee versus independent contractor determination. The grid is only a guide and should not be used as a checklist to determine a certain score required to come to a conclusion. There's no such thing as a score. You have to apply your mind and logic and come to a conclusion. Each indicator must be analysed with regard to the particular context. So industry, business type, kind of customer, kind of worker, and how the business operates. Okay, those are all contexts that will be looked at. The auditor must analyse the situation in light of the indicators and their relative weightings and arrive at a dominance impression. So, as we're going to talk about a bit later, you need to apply your mind. You need to come to that dominance impression, and you have to explain very carefully how you came to that. Your logic is flawed, you're going to have a problem, and SARS are going to pull apart your determination. Okay, so the weighting will determine whether there's the acquisition of the person's productive capacity, or are you getting the result of the worker's productive capacity. So the acquisition of this productive capacity is an employment relationship, and getting the results of this person's productive capacity suggests an independent contractor. So you bring in a plumber, his result is to sort your plumbing out, okay? That's suggesting an independent contractor relationship. It is critical that you gather as much information as possible through thorough investigation. You need to ask the hard questions. Often I see people do not ask those hard questions because the managing director has put this person into the organization and they don't want to rock the boat. It's critical that you, as the payroll person, do the right thing, because you're getting paid to do your job, and you're very likely to be held responsible if you've obviously made an incorrect adjudication. It's best to put a detailed motivation in writing in terms of why, okay, and I say here why a potential indicator does not indicate what it apparently does. So you need to explain why the situation is different, that you wouldn't use an indicator at its correct weight, as an example. Interviews with appropriate third parties must also be done to help arrive at the most accurate conclusion. A gut feel is not sufficient. If you're going to tell SARS, well, I've just got this gut feel, they're going to laugh at you. You need to have detailed written motivations. Remember that as an employer, you're effectively presenting a case as the defense would in a criminal trial. Now, that sounds a bit harsh, but it is true. You do not want to be sitting in front of 3 SARS auditors and not have your facts. You need to have this detailed evaluation. I know I have got some clients that have actually got a flow chart with areas to make comments, and the person they're evaluating after this extensive process signs it and provides a written affidavit. That type of thing would hold you in good stead if you were in this precarious position of having to defend your decision against what SARS are trying to say. SARS want to see the correct application of the legislation. They want to see facts, and they want to see how the facts and circumstances have been brought together to arrive at a logical, understandable conclusion. As I said, this is not a tick box exercise. Okay, let's look at the near conclusive indicators. These indicators provide insight into the quality of control, the nature of the financial relations, and the degree of exclusivity of the relationship. The indicators are considered to be deciding factors in distinguishing between the acquisition of this productive capacity as opposed to the result of productive capacity. So, like we've discussed in the statutory test, control is very, very critical. Control suggests that there's an employment relationship. Excuse me. If your employer controls the manner in which work is done, decides what training you're going to receive, manages your outcome, processes, performance, that's pointing in the direction of there being an employer-employee relationship. The payment regime, payments without reference to results indicate employment. Okay, so let's look at that. You get paid by your employer to deliver 21.67 days of work a month. Okay, You might have a quiet month at work and sit around and do nothing the whole day. You're still going to get paid. In the independent contractor relationship, your employer is not going to pay an independent contractor for sitting around for a whole month. They're going to pay them on the achievement of a result. So in other words, our IT system has a bug. We bring in an IT specialist. That person sorts out the bug, gets everything up and running. You pay that person. Okay, so payment is dependent on the results. The leans towards there being an independent contractor relationship. Payment without reference to results or time indicates an employment relationship. The person who must render the service, obviously, employment is one of personal service. Whereas, if you're bringing in an independent contractor, there might be 5 guys working for this IT company. Any one of those people could provide the service. It's not dependent on one person. When there's one person, you're always on thin ice. It's very difficult for one person to be an independent contractor until they've got a work history, until they've got multiple clients, until they can prove that they're not economically dependent on one person. Nature of obligation to work. Contract of employment by time and not results, as I said, would suggest employment, the acquisition of productive capacity. Employer-based, the acquisition of the exclusive use of productive capacity would suggest employment. And then the dependent contractor obviously is free to seek out other business opportunities. So going back to my point, if I come back from my wanderings around the world and I come back to South Africa and I want to be an independent contractor, obviously I'm going to have to sign up my first client. That doesn't automatically mean because I've only got one client and I'm economically dependent on them, that I'm the employee. I may have advertising out on 20 different areas saying that I'm offering my services. I might not be, I'm unlikely to be at that person's premises all the time. So employer base is important, but it's not the be all and end all. Profit, risk and loss. Exposure to risk would suggest independent contractor, whereas obviously your employee remuneration is less likely, your remuneration at the end of the month is less likely to be under or at risk. You contracted to earn X amounts of money. So unless there's significant financial strain in the business, you will get your salary at the end of the month. An employee is generally paid irrespective of defective workmanship. So, you're an employee on the production line and you're not very good at your job and there's a lot of defective components going past, you would traditionally get paid irrespective of that. You might get disciplined or you might get sent for retraining, whereas an independent contractor is being paid for their results. If workmanship's defective, you're going to not get paid, you're going to get called back and you're going to be made to fix it. An employee would receive a fixed salary irrespective of incompetence, inefficiency, or wastefulness. An independent contractor would agree a fee but would bear the risk of loss if their performance was unsatisfactory. I think that explains itself. An independent contractor is free to make business decisions that affect profitability, whereas an employee would effectively do as they're told to do and have very little input in this space. Okay, so the second category, the persuasive indicators. These examine the degree or extent of behavioral control, as well as the purpose of acquiring the control. Control enables management to convert productive capacity into productive activity. Okay, so the first indicator is instructions or supervision. The employer controls the work done and the environment in which work is done, whereas your independent contractor is not going to be under that supervision. They have to deliver results. They will decide the best way or the expected industry way of dealing with a specific issue. Independent contractor would still probably be monitored. I mean, you got plumbers in your business, you would pop in and see how things are going, in terms of time-wise and in terms of quality of work. But there's not the same level of supervision as there is in an employer-employee relationship. A restraint of trade would point towards an employment relationship, whereas a secrecy clause, a non-disclosure agreement, etc., would point towards there being an independent contractor agreement. Reports. The history of reporting indicates a measure of supervision. Obviously, if you've got a hectically controlled process of reporting, that would definitely point towards an employment relationship. Training. An employee would receive training from the employer as to how they're expected to do their job, industry standards and norms. Training relates to the quality of control, if its purpose is to promote an exclusive production technique or form of service provision. So your employer obviously would pay for all that training to ensure that you meet those industry standards. But I mean, there are cases where an independent contractor agent type person would have training, product training, because that person may be selling your products as part of their bag of tricks, out in the market. So putting an independent agent on some product training is not per se going to make an employer-employee relationship. Productive time. Should the worker contract away their right to control their time, this would be a suggestion of there being an employment relationship. Whereas an independent contractor would agree to have something done at a certain time, and would basically come and go, schedule one client in front of another to ensure that the work on their plate for that week gets done. Okay, and then the last category of indicators are the resonance indicators. This category of indicator would give insights into how parties view their relationship. While these indicators must be considered, they may be susceptible to contractual manipulation or relate tenuously to the distinction between the two concepts. So this is where the waters get muddy, and this is where the ducking and diving takes place, when people are trying to hide the actual facts of this relationship. Okay, so the first tool, the first indicator is tools, machinery, stationery. Okay, so your independent contractor is going to come in with their own tools, machinery. Very seldom you're going to see an employee required to supply their own tools, machinery. Obviously, if they're providing their productive capacity to an employer, they would expect the employer to provide the tools. Office or workshop. To have a name on the door where your independent contractor comes in and sits in the office is going to point towards this being a sham relationship, and it would point towards there being an employer-employee relationship. Your independent contractor would maybe work in the boardroom or share an office with someone for the time that they're undertaking a certain process. They certainly wouldn't have their own office, because that's indicating that they're there a significant amount of time. Integration or employer's usual work premises. If the person is integrated into and operates from the employer's usual place of work, this would suggest an employment relationship. So it's just an extension of the office or workshop indicator. Integration or usual business operations. If this person is engaged in activities that are integral or ancillary to the employer's business operations, this may indicate an employer-employee relationship. This is particularly true if the person's survival is dependent on this link. So the operations manager is an independent contractor, would definitely not fly with SARS. That person is integral to your organization. That person makes sure that things move forward in the manufacturing or service environment. So that would suggest an employer-employee relationship. Integration, hierarchy, organogram. If you're integrated into a business organization and you're on the organogram, or you have a job description, this is very, very likely going to point towards an employer-employee relationship. I can't see any situation where the independent contractor could potentially be in a organogram, unless there's some sort of a joint venture going on, I suppose, and that person's there just for the short term to deliver certain results. Duration of the relationship. An open-ended, indefinite relationship would suggest an employment relationship. An independent contractor relationship would end at the achievement of a result. Okay, so don't get confused. I mean, if you bring in the same plumber every time there's a plumbing issue, that doesn't mean because you've had a long-term relationship with this person that they're an employee. You need to look at, is this person expected to be there all the time? Is this relationship fixed to that extent? And that would suggest the person being an employee. Termination and breach of contract. The threat of termination of a contract is linked to employment. Obviously, there's in terms of legislation, the right to dismiss or resign. So that indicates employment. A breach of contract suggests an independence. Significant investment. An investment in an enterprise. So I invest in my own enterprise. That suggests independence. If I have a company investing in my tools and laptop, etc., that would suggest an employment relationship. Okay, bona fide business expenses, statutory compliance. An employee should not incur any business expenses unless they have the odd reimbursement process, whereas an independent contractor would incur costs related to the running of their business to make that business profitable. And an independent contractor would be required to comply with statutory regulations and make statutory submissions. Your employee wouldn't. In the employment relationship, the company would be making those declarations and submissions. Headings, labels, or terminology aimed to deceive must be identified. And the basis for the presence of the person must be backed up by the facts of the case. The claiming of expenses must not be an attempt at muddying the waters in the adjudication process, and the expenses must be analysed to determine validity. Okay, so viability on termination, also a potentially good point. A person who's not viable on termination would suggest that there's being an employee. So in other words, I work for an organisation, I get terminated until I find another job. I don't have money, so I'm not viable. So that would suggest an employment relationship, whereas, if you terminate your relationship with a plumber, that person just carries on providing services to other people. They're still economically viable. Obviously, if they've got a very big contract with you, it's going to hurt them, but they're not looking for another job. They would just be looking for other clients. An independent contractor with a history of such would not necessarily be negatively impacted by the fact that they may lack a multiple concurrent client base or be currently economically dependent on a current client. Okay, so what they're saying there is, if your intention is truly to be an independent contractor, you have to start somewhere. And if you start with a nice contract, but you're advertising, you're looking, and you're dabbling, and you're obviously trying to get sell more hours, that would suggest you being an independent contractor. And then industry norms and custom. In certain industries, being an independent contractor may be custom or norm. Maybe less likely the person would contract in the form of an employee. And norms or customs might create a trading climate that either mitigates against or promotes economic viability. Okay, so here's your test grid. Here's your dominance impression test. Okay, so the near conclusive indicators, you'll see across the top, you've got your indicator, and you've got suggest employee status, you've got suggest independent contractor status. So essentially what you must be doing, and remember, no tick box exercise. I'm happy for you to tick employee or independent contractor, but you need to write why you've made the determination against that particular indicator. Okay, so that's important. And then persuasive indicators are your middle band, same setup. And then you've got your relevant, your resonant indicators. You can see there's more there. So, as I said, it's not a tick box exercise, but you can. So let's just go back to it. You can, when you're doing the tick box, get quite a good idea that 90% of your evaluations are in the independent contractor field. But as I said to you, you can't just do that. You have to put some meat on the process. Okay, what I've also done, I thought it was very, very important to include this, is we've covered the tax side of independent contractor employee, but what does the Basic Conditions of Employment Act and the Labour Relations Act say? So both of these acts have this topic in them, and what they essentially say is, okay, until the contrary is proved, a person who works for or renders services to any other person is presumed, regardless of the form of the contract, to be an employee if any one or more of the following factors are present. Okay, so now the standard is obviously a lot lower here. SARS have got their interpretation note, they've got this test, and you have to go through it with a fine-tooth comb. The labour legislation is saying that if any one or more of these is applicable, there's an employment relationship. And you'll see that some of these are common. Let's go through them quickly. There's only 7 of them. The manner in which the work is done is subject to the controlled supervision. So there's your controlled supervision test. The person's hours of work are subject to the control and direction. Okay, there we go. There's another test. In the case of a person who works for an organization, that person forms part of that organization. We've also seen that in the common law tests. The person has worked for that person for an average of 40 hours per month over the last 3 months. That one could muddy the waters, maybe. The person is economically dependent on the other person. We've also seen that in the common law dependence tests. The person is provided with tools of the trade. We've also seen that test. And the person only works or renders services to one person. We've also seen that in the test. So in terms of all your labor issues, hours of work, overtime, blah, 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 this test is going to control, are you an employee, are you an independent contractor? And a lot of people are going to fall into the definition of employee in terms of this legislation. Okay, so the challenges. What is obvious is there's a huge disparity in terms of the complexity of the two decision-making processes. Labor legislation is very vague with your 7 points, of which one must apply, one or more must apply. Whereas you have to be relatively skilled to do the SARS interpretation. I've mentioned that it's obviously a lot easier to be classified an employee in terms of the basic conditions of the Labour Relations Act. Significantly more of a process to identify employment in terms of SARS interpretation at 17. Okay. Whilst every effort has been made to simplify it, it requires some degree of technical knowledge and ability to collect and evaluate information, and most importantly, make an informed decision. I don't want to be difficult here, but in my day-to-day, involvement with people. And I think in life in general, a lot of people have problems with logic. A lot of people have to be led more. And, the ability to think logically and behave rationally is something that not many people have. So that makes doing this adjudication process significantly harder. If you're easily swayed or you have a predetermined outcome in your mind, you're going to really battle with this interpretation. Both processes are important, though, as there's legislation that needs to be adhered to. The penalties that SARS imposes for getting the employer independent contractor decision wrong are tough. So that would definitely get your attention. A basic understanding of the valuation process is important, and I hope you now have an idea of how you would follow that. Don't be embarrassed. I personally still have cases where I sit on the fence and I literally lie in bed at night and I think, I need to make a decision. How do I sway this one way or another? If I'm going to leave you with one piece of advice, it will be follow the process, document every step, and if the process leans towards it being an independent contractor, make them sign an affidavit. Once they sign that affidavit and your evaluation should be enough to keep SARS at bay. SARS can then tackle that person. Because if I'm sitting opposite you and you know this legislation and you lie from step 1 to Z to me, I'm not going to know that. I can apply my logic, but if you're going to lie and tell me what I want to hear, I can only follow the process based on what you say. So once that person's done an affidavit, they take responsibility for this decision-making process. SARS is less likely to hold the company responsible for the recovery of PAYE if there's a fully documented process and the independent contractor has made a legal declaration as to their position. The employer does not have a crystal ball and has to rely on the honesty of the contractor. I think that's fair. That's basically enough legislation for the day. You're welcome, as it says on the screen, to attend any future webinars. We're on YouTube. The webinars on our website. You're always welcome to pop in at any stage and chat. If you want to chat to me in terms of helping you in the process, you're welcome to give me a call. Okay, let's just quickly go through the questions. Please can you send us the link to version 4 to go through? Okay, what I'll do is I will give Candice that interpretation note and she can send the slides and that to you. Isandri, if you have independent contractors with these payments are paid by procurement and not through the payroll, does that mean? Okay, if you've got a truly independent contractor, you don't need to put them through the payroll. I mean, your plumber is going to be very annoyed with you if you insist on paying them through the payroll because, he's going to have an extra RP5 on his tax return for no reason. If the person is honestly an independent contractor, if in the cases where you're a little bit more concerned, you may want to go the RP5 route. Is under again, the independent contractor should be able to claim the expenses in their personal capacity based on the fact that there's an invoice. I have no, yes. So basically, your independent contractor is going to give you a quote. They're going to do that project. So it might be in an IT company. They want to come in and they want to do a process. That process is 3 months. Okay, they give you a quote. You pay them on reaching certain targets. They give you an invoice. You pay them at the end. You do the valuation of their work. They've done what they've required, and they move off. Fine. They deal with their own expenses. When it comes to you providing covering expenses. Now you're starting to muddy the water a little bit. Okay, why aren't they taking their own risk? You know, for example, if they say to you, we'll give you a list of our expenses a month and you must reimburse us now. That's, you know, that's sounding decidedly dodgy. You know, if for example, it's a huge IT project and there is a big outlay, their contract might say that we require 75% of the contract fee up front, because you know that they have to go and buy servers and there's going to be expenses, and that you know that you've got 25% to hold back if you're not happy with the project. You've at least got this hardware, okay? But you know, if they're giving you an invoice with mileage every month and, you know, buying little knickknacks here and there, I would be quite worried about that relationship. I would dig more. And then finally, Jane, is it possible to be an employee of an organization as well as an independent contractor? For example, a person is employed as a debtor's clerk working 20 hours a week. This employee does mechanic work in the afternoons in their own house. The employee is contracted to fix one of his employee's pool cars. Does this form part of his remuneration? Okay, obviously a little bit more complicated case, but you can definitely be both. If I work half-day job as a debtor's clerk, I accept employment. Okay, so but you could have another job in the afternoon fixing cars, and you honestly fix cars for anyone. The fact that one of those cars is a pool car belonging to the company that you do debtors work for, I don't think that muddies the water. I think that would be fine. But I mean, if you only did that in the afternoon and you only did work cars, the pool cars, that may be looked at. But yeah, Jane, definitely you can be both. I think particularly in the industry we're in now and the times we're in now is, in America as an example, I know in the UK, when I lived in the UK, a lot of people have more than one job. So, I think they call it a side hustle now, but, in terms of meeting financial obligations on a monthly basis, if you have to do 5 things to meet those obligations, that's not a problem. I'm just saying that whoever's contracting you, so you could effectively be in employment with 5 people. If you do debtors 3 days a week for one company, 2 days a week for another, on weekends for another company, you're in employment with 3 different companies, and they're required to do an evaluation on you as to your status. Obviously, if you get to the point where you're doing enough debtors work and you're doing it independently, you're not necessarily doing it at their premises. You're taking on all your own financial risks, and you invoice based on achieving a result, and you start employing people, then that's different. Then we cross that bridge and we re-look at the facts. But in terms of your question, you can definitely be an employee in the mornings and an independent contractor doing something else in the afternoon. There's nothing wrong with that. Okay, folks, that looks like that. I can't see any. Let me just have a look. Sorry. Sorry, there is one more. The net running costs similar to commission. Okay, so an independent contractor would. There's a difference between a commission agent and an independent contractor. A commission agent is someone in employment. The income reflected against that commission agent is code 3606. They can claim expenses against that commission. And that's the only example where you're in employment where you can actually claim expenses. Bearing in mind, you have to, your commission income has to be more than 50% of your total income. So if you're in employment and your boss gives you a salary of 50, but you earn 10 grand commission, you can't claim expenses. But if you are a commission agent and you take the risk of earning nothing or a large amount of money, depending on the contractual rules and targets set up, your income is code 3606 and you can claim expenses. An independent contractor, similarly, is an independent person. They take the risks of doing their trade and they can claim expenses against that income. In terms of being a provisional taxpayer, definitely. SARS, if you're an employee, SARS is getting your PAYE on a monthly basis. If you're a commission agent, you get a tax directive and PAYE is deducted monthly as well. An independent contractor, SARS want their income twice a year, with obviously your tax return and assessment dictating whether an additional payment is due or you due a refund. So independent contractor, definitely. I've seen quite a few recently where people have lost their jobs due to COVID and have gone into being independent contractors and have not registered as provisional tax return. You'll get year one as SARS will overlook year one, but if you are in now year two, your first provisional tax was due yesterday, so you've got a challenge. But I hope that answers all the questions. If you've got more questions, you're welcome to contact me. Okay, folks, thank you so much as usual. I'm not sure when my next webinar is, but we have webinars every week. Interesting topics will be sent out normally on the Monday before. Thank you very much and have a fantastic day.